Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In today's episode, we're talking about a journalist who left her lucrative career in TV news to launch her own podcast. In terms of career advancement, Brandi Kruse was at the top of her game. As a TV news correspondent in the large media market of Seattle, she was paid more than most of her industry peers, and she even hosted her own long-form weekly talk show. But in late 2021, she quit her job and immediately launched her own podcast called Undivided. Within weeks of the launch, she amassed over 2,000 paying subscribers on Patreon, and she now delivers her commentary and interviews to over 200,000 followers across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Here's a clip from a recent episode.
The idea that we would paint someone as un-American for exercising a right given to them by our Constitution is unbelievable to me. The right of people to peacefully assemble, to protest in this country, is enshrined in the First Amendment to our Constitution. The First Amendment doesn't say anything about what you can or cannot protest, what kind of protest it can be, as long as it's peaceful. That is an American right. It's a right that men and women have died for. And it is the right of every single American to peacefully protest their government in any way that they see fit, for any reason that they see fit. And that is what, for several years, WNBA star Brittany Griner chose to do. But now, as our fellow American is going on 6 months of imprisonment in a hostile country, there are some Americans who want to hold her protest over her head, who want to hold her protests against her, who want to mock her, who want to suggest that she deserves what's happening to her because she dared to exercise the rights that the Constitution of this country gave her to protest her government.
How did Brandi find this audience? And why did she ditch her well-paying job in TV? In our interview, she explains how she grew a large following on Facebook and used it as a launching pad for her independent career. She also told me about her efforts to expand beyond local news and into national politics. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about this week's sponsor, Memberful. Memberful is the easiest way to sell memberships to an audience, used by the biggest creators on the web. Whether you are a creator yourself or you're building a membership integration for a client, Memberful handles the hard stuff so you can focus on what you do best and earn revenue quickly. If you're looking to add membership to your existing business, you want a solution that works with your existing technology so you can launch a new revenue stream without rebuilding your entire tech stack. Memberful seamlessly integrates with the tools you already use, like WordPress, MailChimp, Discord, and lots more. Memberful maintains a full-featured GraphQL API, webhooks, and OAuth single sign-on to make it easy to integrate seamlessly with any stack. It maintains a best-in-class WordPress plugin to add membership and content restriction to your website. Use a custom domain name so everything is fully branded under your name. You have full control and ownership of your audience, your brand, and your membership. It connects directly with Stripe for secure payments and handles all of the transactional emails. Learn more at memberful.com and get started for free. No credit card required. I'll leave a link in the description. Okay, now on to my interview with Brandi. Hey Brandi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I brought you on because you are a full-time creator who's built this really awesome business that focuses on a mix of local and national politics. But first, let's talk about how you got here. You started in traditional news. What kind of work did you do?
And I never thought, had you told me a year ago that I would be leaving my job in corporate media, I'd been like, you're crazy. I get paid well. I really love it. I started off, so I went to school for journalism at the University of Nebraska. So I'm like, have whatever a traditional education in journalism means. means. That's what I have. Not that I think that people actually need one. And then I went to school for radio. I had always intended to be a radio journalist. So my first job was with the CBS radio affiliate in Seattle, KIRO. And so I did mostly investigative reporting for them. I was pretty young. I think I got that job at 21. I did that job for 3 or 4 years, and then a news director at a TV station in town, the Fox affiliate in Seattle, Fox 13. We had drinks, and she's like, "Hey, you want to do TV and do the same thing you were doing on radio, just on TV?" I was like, "Sure." And so they cut my hair and put more makeup on my face, and then I did TV for 7 years.
When did you start in TV?
I believe it was 2015.
And what were you doing for them? Like, were you like a correspondent that was going out into the field?
Yeah. So for the first couple years, I mostly covered crime and politics. I was a specialty assignment reporter. And so I wasn't on the air every day to start off with. I was doing in-depth investigative reporting, mostly on crime and justice. I was doing a lot of covering protests. Seattle is a protest-prone city. If there's a reason to take to the streets, people here do it. And so I was covering the Occupy movement, and that folded into our annual May Day protests/riots, which consumed the city for years. And then around the time of the 2016 presidential election, I made a segue into covering politics, and I started appearing daily on our morning newscast.
And then you eventually got your own show or some kind of interview show?
Yeah, so I think it was around 2016, things had become so divisive, and I went to my news director and I said, "Hey, I want to do a weekly segment called The Divide." I pitched the whole thing to her, just focusing on controversial issues that we could try to find common ground on, because as you know, the media climate, the political climate, everything was just devolving into this just nasty mess. And so she said, "Oh, well, why don't you do that, but just put it on your Facebook page." And so she gave me the green light, but I'd tape it and I just put it on my Facebook page. And then a couple weeks later, she's like, "Let's put it on TV." So it just lived within a newscast, this little 3 to 4 minute clip on whatever story I wanted to do that week. And then after a couple years, The Divide turned into a Sunday morning political program that aired before Fox News Sunday locally in the Seattle DMA. And I thought it was really unique. I mean, there was nothing like it in the country. It was part commentary, part just in-depth political coverage. And its mission was sort of to try to return politics and news to some semblance of common sense. And I think it really catered to moderates. And so I hosted that show for 2 years, loved it. I really felt like this is what I need to be doing. And then Fox 13 during the pandemic was bought by Fox. We got new management, and my whole sort of world at the news station imploded. And what I was doing, it became clear I was not going to be able to do anymore. And so that's when I made the decision that it was time for me to leave.
So a lot of my audience probably doesn't watch local TV news. I certainly don't, but I've read enough about it to know that it's still like one of the most highly engaging, like a huge portion of America still watches local news. And there's like kind of like a weird, intense loyalty to, like, they feel like they have a relationship, almost a parasocial relationship with a lot of newscasters. How did you start, like, while you were in TV news, how did you see that manifested on your online social media following? Because you started to build up a following before you left TV news.
Well, and there are some bloggers in town who said I had a cult following. And I think that's because I didn't just cater to the Seattle crowd. I also, took into account the fact that our channel reached a lot of people outside of the city in the country who had much different political views. And so, yeah, I mean, local news coverage is much different than national news coverage. You do build relationships. You have anchors who've been anchoring the same newscasts for 10, 15 years. And you have people, I would say mostly the older generation, who still are really, really dedicated and loyal to a specific news station and a specific newscast. I would say for me, when I really started to get a dedicated following, was coverage first of the protests, being out there, being sort of in the mix of things. There were a lot of high profile incidents that happened. And then when I launched The Divide, like I said, I just don't think there was anything like it. And there was a huge segment of our viewership who I think appreciated during that time period a show that wasn't totally catering to the left politics of Seattle and would at least hear out other voices and other politicians. And so, yeah, I mean, had it not been for the fact that I was in the Seattle market for as long as I was, and I still am here, obviously, but for 10 plus years doing news, I don't think I could have cultivated an audience that was dedicated enough to make an independent venture successful.
Yeah, and I was watching some of your videos before this, and one thing I noticed is that you don't hesitate to talk about divisive political issues and even off your opinion, but your politics are kind of hard to pin down. Would that be accurate?
Well, and I think a lot of people are like that, and this is the niche that I'm filling is a challenging one because I consider myself a moderate. In Seattle, I'm probably right of center, but if you dropped me, where are you at, Simon?
I'm in D.C., so you
okay.
I
right of center there, but if you drop me, outside of the Beltway, I'd probably be left of center. And so, I think I'm like a lot of people my age who are socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And so it's a challenging, so that is where I am politically. It's not a facade, this idea of undivided, which is now, I changed the divide to undivided for my independent venture. It is really who I am, and I don't fit into a box that a big party made for me. And so I'm, on any given day, I might be on either side of an issue. And so one of the things that has been challenging about that is when you're relying on, people to be paid subscribers, one day I might really piss that subscriber off, and the other day they might be in full agreement with me, and so that's just something that I have to accept. But yeah, I mean, I give my opinion now. I'm firmly in the camp of political commentary, and it should be hard to pin me to a Democrat or Republican because I don't consider myself either.
Okay, and we'll get more into the content side a little bit later, but let's go back. So the TV station gets acquired by a media company. I guess it was by the company formerly known as News Corp, the company that owns Fox News and Fox Business News and all that kind of stuff. And you begin to clash with management. What was kind of the concept?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have any non-disclosure, but essentially we were suffering from staffing issues at the time, and it was very severe. And I think this happened in newsrooms across the country, where it was part of the Great Resignation. Nobody left because they were forced out or layoffs or anything like that. But I think you had a lot of people in news who realized, and the pandemic made them realize, like, I don't need this level of stress for this much pay. I'm going to go do something else where I can work from home. And so we lost half of our newsroom staff during the pandemic. And for a local news, I mean, we lost 22 employees in a year. And for a local newsroom, that is a ton of employees to lose from a news division. And so we had new management that came in from Fox. And the first meeting I had with our new general manager, she said that they were going to put my show on hiatus because of the staffing issues. And at that time, I realized, like, okay, that's understandable, right? We need to focus on just getting our newscasts on the air. But then it became clear that if my show were going to come back, there were going to be some changes to it that I didn't agree with, editorial oversight that I hadn't had before, some other changes, and I had a clash with management over that. And so I took 2 weeks off to really just get my bearings and decided, you know what, I think I'm going to try to make, because I didn't want to let go of what I was doing. We had really built up to make The Divide, which was the show, something that was not only, I think, popular, but meaningful. I found it personally meaningful. And the idea of going back from that, of not having that show, of returning to just sort of the coverage of politics I had been doing before, I thought, I'm not going to wake up and be happy and think that I'm doing something impactful at the end of the day. And so I made the decision to ask to be removed from my contract. I was still under contract, but I made the decision to ask. My agent asked, and they obliged.
And what made you confident that you could transition to working for a media company to going off on your own? I actually had another, I don't know if you know who this is, but I had someone named Erica Mandy. She was a CBS TV, local TV news reporter, and she left and launched her own daily podcast that's really successful. Were you looking at other examples? Like what gave you that confidence that you thought you could make a business work like that?
Well, to say I was confident would be an overstatement. But just to... I wasn't 100% confident, but I did, try to do what I could to understand where would I be financially. A little background on me. I grew up very poor. And so the idea that I was making what I was making, doing my dream job, was something I never could have imagined. I made really good money. And I think, and I've said this before, I think I was one of the highest paid people on TV in the market, based on conversations with people at other stations. And so to let that go was not only, it was terrifying, right? But it was also like, gosh, what am I getting myself into? But there was a couple things that I did. There was a podcast called Blocked and Reported. And one of the co-hosts of it used to work for The Stranger, which is just an alt weekly.
Katie Herzog.
Yeah, Katie Herzog. And so I had reached out to Katie because they had something like 3,000, 3,500 subscribers. And I kind of did the math and I was like, well, if I can get up to that, that would be, I would be able to replenish kind of what I was making at least. And so I talked to her about it. And then I ended up just... That week I decided to quit my job. I had gone fishing in like this remote fishing village out on the coast in Washington just to clear my head because I was in a mentally just not a very good place. And this is like before I had told them, hey, I want to leave. And I ended up just starting a Patreon page, not making it live or anything like that. I just wanted to poke around, and immediately Patreon got in touch with me and said, hey, we've looked at your social media accounts. If you're going to start a Patreon, we really think you could do well. Do you want to set up a meeting? And so I had a meeting with Patreon. And what they told me is that they have found that about 0.5 to 3% of someone's existing social media audience will pay for their content. That doesn't sound like much, but when I considered, okay, I've got around 350,000, let's say it's on the low end of that, like 0.5%, I think that math would work. So that was really one of the moments, seeing the success of Blocked and Reported on Patreon, although they later left for Substack. But then, talking to Patreon and them giving me an actual concrete range of most people fall in this range. That made me confident. And then I also knew that I had a really loyal base of supporters. Because have you ever heard of something called ShareRocket?
ShareRocket.
So ShareRocket is something utilized by some newsrooms across the country that is essentially...
Oh, it's like an analytics
Yeah,
platform.
it's like Nielsen, which is the ratings for TV, but it rates your social media strength. And not only that, it rates your engagement. How engaged, because you can have 1 million followers, but they might not be engaging with your content at all. And I had a very high engagement rate, which I knew might translate into people who were more eager to get my content and would pay for it. So that's sort of things that I took into account. I also knew that if I were going to do it, I would have to leave with a bang. Like I couldn't disappear from my job for a month and then come back on Patreon and be like, hey, sign up for my stuff. So when I announced I was leaving the day that my last day on air at Fox 13. There was no ramp up to it, nothing. I did the November election last year, did that coverage, and then left on that Friday after the election. That's the first time I told people at work. It's the first time I told, people, and I said, I'll have more on what I'm doing next on Sunday. So I had one day. I left my job on a Friday, launched Undivided on a Sunday. And so the momentum from that is what helped me to get people on board right away, as opposed to just having subscribers sort of trickle in, which wouldn't have been doable.
And so you had a lot of social media followers, I think primarily on Facebook and Twitter, right?
Facebook is my largest by far, yeah.
That's what, like 80,000?
173,000.
Oh, wow. Okay. And then you have like 60,000 on Twitter.
Something like that.
So you have a very large social media following. You left the day after the 2020 election?
The 2021 election.
So in Washington, they have them in off
Yeah,
years?
we have off-year elections, which they're trying to get rid of, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you leave after the November 2021. You announced your Patreon. What were you launching exactly?
So initially, it was a twice-weekly podcast called Undivided. So the whole product was called Undivided. And it was essentially exactly what I was doing on Fox 13, but it was independent. So I was adding a twice-weekly podcast, so a half hour on Mondays, a half hour on Fridays, and then a half-hour Sunday digital show, which was modeled after the show I was doing on Fox.
And so you're putting content on podcasts that are going out to all podcast apps. Then you're also creating video. Is the video just video version of the podcast, or is it something that's like completely
It was completely different. I've changed my model now as of June 15th, but at the time it was a bonus thing. So everyone could get the podcast, but only subscribers could get the half-hour digital show. And then throughout the week, I'd maybe do some op-eds here and there, all around that central mission of what I call political commentary for the anti-fringe. And then I would do, one-off videos here and there if a subject came up during the week where I thought this would make a really good video segment. I'd do a one-off video that would be available to anyone.
Mm-hmm. And so people would become a paying subscriber and they would get email in their inbox whenever you would upload an exclusive Patreon exclusive video. And then was that like an unlisted YouTube video, or was that hosted on Patreon, or how did
I actually got really lucky because Patreon never had hosted video, but right when I signed up for Patreon, they were starting to test that feature. And so they asked me to be one of the people who were testing it. So I got really lucky because I was one of the first people to test the Patreon native video. And I think they've now made it official for everyone. But it was funny, I had other friends on Patreon who were like, how are you uploading these videos? And I'm like, I think it's... So it would be on Patreon. And then I did launch a locals a couple months later. We could talk about that if you want, but...
You launched
a locals page as well.
What is a locals?
You don't know what locals is?
No.
Oh, locals is basically for people who don't trust Patreon. Patreon has a history of deplatforming people out of nowhere, which is terrifying when you're relying on that for your income. I don't think I post things that are controversial enough to be deplatformed, although I was in Facebook jail yesterday for reasons unknown for 24 hours. But I did start a locals page, which caters more to to conservatives. I don't even have close to as many subscribers on locals, but it was a way to sort of diversify and to do a catch-all for people who didn't trust Patreon or who had heard bad things about Patreon. I've had no issues with Patreon.
So for the podcast, are you doing like interviews, or what are you doing for the podcast?
Yeah, well, I've expanded it now. I can tell you a little bit about how that went. So basically for the first 6 months, I thought, let me just throw everything at these people and see what they like the most. I mean, I was paying a cartoonist. I had was paying not subscribers. I was paying contributors to file reports from different places. And I was like, let me just see what works. And then when I felt like, okay, we're like cooking, we've got some money, we want to expand, I put out a poll to subscribers 3 or 4 months ago and said, hey, what do you want to see more of? And based on that, we consolidated everything we were doing now into 3 one-hour podcasts a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The Wednesday podcast is exclusive to subscribers, and the podcast is also video. So you can either watch them or you can listen to them, but it's the exact same product, so it's streamlined in that way. And it's a mix. So on yesterday's show on Monday, I had one of our paid contributors, Allie Bradley, who's a border correspondent, who did a report on, we did a talk back on the DHS report on the agents who whipped migrants but actually didn't whip migrants. So we do a lot of like in-depth interviews. Tomorrow we'll have Jason Kander on, who's just out with a new book. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He almost ran for president and then ended up dropping out of a different political race to deal with his PTSD from his time in the service. So we do interviews, I do commentary, and then on Fridays we kind of keep it fun, and I've got some reoccurring segments that we do on the show on Fridays.
So you're taking audio, but you're recording video and kind of repurposing it as like on video channels, like on Facebook and YouTube?
Yeah, so I've got the 3 one-hour shows, and they go out simultaneously on all my platforms as the podcast and as the video, because some people don't want to watch an hour-long video. Maybe there's a data thing or whatever. And then I take little clips from the shows, and I'll push them out across my social media platforms and on YouTube and stuff.
And where do you see the most engagement?
Facebook.
Out of all those?
Yeah, Facebook is still my largest platform. YouTube, I'm very new to. I think I've only got maybe almost 7,000 subscribers on YouTube. So that's a new thing for me, trying to figure out how to best utilize YouTube. But what I find is that there's a political difference amongst my social media platforms. More people on the left on Twitter, and then more people on the right on Facebook. And so, yeah, Facebook by far is the largest platform in terms of engagement.
And so, like, people on Facebook will sit there and watch an entire hour video of you.
I look at the analytics, and sometimes there's drop-off after a little bit, or they'll click on, because I always give them the option to go watch on Patreon or YouTube, so sometimes they'll click on that. But if I take the clips, so I'll take from the hour, let's say I've got a segment that's 8 minutes, and I'll repost it the next day, the clips get more engagement on Facebook than the hour-long video, for sure.
Yeah, and that's like a lot of podcasters are doing that, where they're creating like almost a separate clips channel where that's where they go and repurpose that, and that gets surfaced by the algorithm and gets more engagement. What about the podcast? Like, have you like obviously podcast? It's harder. It's a more loyal audience because it's like everything's presented in reverse chronological order. You have to like open up the app and subscribe, so like the loyalty is higher, but that there's also downsides in terms of it's harder to build an audience. How have you felt that's been going in terms of building just the podcast audio only?
Well, the podcast listenership has grown steadily. One of the challenges, though, is I saw a drop off. So we launched this new format June 15th. And immediately there was a drop off in the number of listeners to the podcast because there were some people who were choosing to watch the video instead. And so obviously they wouldn't then turn around and watch or listen to the podcast. So it's been a little harder to track growth because now I'm splitting the same show off into two different channels. Either you watch or you listen. But I get a lot of great feedback on the podcast. One of the challenges I'm dealing with right now is because now I've added this weekly Wednesday bonus episode. I'm working with Audio Boom trying to get a private RSS feed so people who are subscribers can listen to it in the way that they used to. Because right now I'm posting those private podcast episodes just to Patreon or locals, and it's a little bit of a different listening experience for them. So I'm working through some bugs, some challenges.
And so let's go back to November 2021. You launched. Talk to me about like the kind of trajectory of audience growth in terms of like did you see like an immediate response in terms of everybody embracing you, or was it like a slow burn of like getting people oriented towards it? What was kind of, obviously you had an already existing following, so you probably had a higher leg up than the average creator who's launching from scratch, but what did you notice from an audience building standpoint?
The way that I did it, and this is what I've told people, because I've had mainstream journalists reach out to me and ask if this is doable. And one of the big things I say is you have to make sure that there is some sort of commotion around your launch, leaving and immediately starting, because I'll just say this, we made $70,000 in one day on launch day. And I got the bulk of subscribers paid for a year membership on Patreon on that first day. I think it was like maybe close to 2,000. And then over the next couple of days, a few hundred more. And then since then, it's been kind of an ebb and flow, like obviously much slower. And Patreon warned that it would be, is you'll have, because of the way we launched, trying to make it sort of an event, because I had been in the market in news for 10 years. And so when I just up and said, hey, I'm leaving, this is my last day, it was sort of a thing. So I took advantage of that. So I had the bulk of subscribers who paid for a year membership up front. We set it up in a way where they get 2 months free for doing that. So there was a motivation for them. It helped to give me some startup money because I had put so much money into equipment and all of this stuff. And so then from there, it's an ebb and flow. You'll get people who come in and sample the product and leave, or people who come in and buy a year membership here and there. And then it's been a growth of like, I would say 50 to 100 a month since then. And then I added locals. And so there's also people who are joining on locals as well.
And you're somewhere on Patreon, you're somewhere north of like 2,000 subscribers.
Yeah, I want to say like 2,200. And then I'm not sure. So on locals, you can either be a member or a supporter. So you can be a member on the page without paying for anything. You just don't get access to the exclusive stuff. And I don't know what the split is on locals between members and supporters.
And what other ways are you monetizing? Do you have sponsorships?
Yeah, so I got really lucky. I have a mortgage company, and that's another thing because the mortgage market's a little down, but there was a mortgage company launching around the time that I quit my job. And at the time, they had been communicating with my old station to do advertising on The Divide, on the show I hosted on the old station. And in that 2 weeks where I kind of took time off to just figure out, am I really going to quit my job? I reached out to that mortgage company. I said, hey, I might go independent. Would you guys be interested in supporting me? They're like, absolutely. And just kind of, I think out of spite, they like pulled any conversations from my old station. And when they launched their business, I launched with them as my title sponsor. And that was, a godsend, just for a little bit of security and a little bit of a safety blanket in the event that my launch didn't go as I had hoped it would go. So yeah, I've got one sponsor, looking to add 2 more, in conversations with people to add 2 more. I really am not wanting, I think based on the amount of content I put out, 3 sponsors is more than enough. I don't want to overwhelm people with sponsorships, but they are really critical to making sure that you have this like steady stream of income and of funding.
And so it sounds like you're not in the sales game, so you want to try to you want to establish long-term relationships with a small number of sponsors rather than having like a new sponsor every single episode.
Yeah, I'm only interested in having 3 and having great relationships. Like our mortgage sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. You see how I got that in? They're a new company, and they started a mortgage company at a really challenging time. Right now, inquiries are way down, but, it's still a company that I'm dedicated to sticking with, and that's dedicated to sticking with the podcast. And then 2 other sponsors that I'm talking to are kind of companies or organizations that I believe in personally. And so I'm very picky about sponsorships. I've had people who've reached out who have just said, I just don't think it's the right fit. So yeah, looking for long-term sponsorships, companies that I believe in that I can just stick with.
Are there any other kind of revenue ideas you want to pursue, like live events or keynote speaking, different stuff like that?
Well, the keynote speaking has been great. It's something I wasn't able to do at Fox because obviously they're not going to let you speak at any sort of politically related events, which totally makes sense. But ever since I quit, I've been doing speaking engagements nonstop, which has been great. I didn't charge an honorarium for the first 6 months because I really saw it as an opportunity to talk about my new venture, talk about the podcast, and gain some lifelong subscribers, which I found to be more valuable than getting, however much for a speaking engagement. But yeah, I've now started booking actually paid speaking engagements since after 6 months, obviously I put the honorarium back in effect. So I've been doing a ton of those. It's been really fun talking about the state of the media, talking about podcasting, talking about politics. It's been great.
And so you started in local news, but you talk about like a range of different issues, including national politics. And I wonder how you strike that balance, because I feel like there's so much competition at everybody has an opinion on national politics, whereas like with local you have like a niche where there are only so many other creators who are really going to be competing with you. You can really differentiate your content. How do you kind of think about how to strike that balance of different topics you want to
Do you
cover?
mean I'm not the only podcaster in the country talking about politics? I thought for sure that I was. No,
I know it's
that is a hard one because my subscriber base is clearly here in Washington State, in the Seattle area. And so I do have to try to, the nice thing is, I will say, there are a lot of Seattle stories that are also national stories. We've had a lot of weird stuff here. Seattle politics is bizarre. We had Chaz Chop and all the unrest that happened in 2020. So the nice thing is there are a lot of stories that have some sort of Seattle tie that are also national. And then you get kind of a twofer. But what I just try to stay true to is the mission of the podcast, which is, so my show, The Divide, on TV, actual TV, was a little bit like, hey, kumbaya, let's come together, let's find common ground. My show now, Undivided, is really a more aggressive rejection of what I consider to be fringe ideologies. It is a show that is meant to give what I believe are the majority of Americans who fall somewhere in the middle, to empower them to really take charge of the conversation and drown out the fringes. And so everything I do on the show is supposed to be in that vein. It is an aggressive rejection of fringe ideologies. And so I think people who follow the show, even though many of them, most of them are local, I think that if there's a national story that fits within that, they're fine with that. And also, I have to be realistic. If I want to grow this, and I do, I have, big hopes and dreams for this for the next few years, I have to be able to put tentacles outside of Seattle, because I'm going to run out of a base here. I'm going to sort of run out of the pool of subscribers that are available to me here and that are interested. So I do have to try to find a way to bring other places into the conversation. Just as an example, I launched a segment on Fridays called Florida Report, because and it's with my sister, lives in Miami. She's hilarious, and she's a little different than me politically. I like to call her like a bougie libertarian. And so she comes on once a week and she does Florida Report, where she talks about whatever's happened, crazy stuff is happening in Florida with, Ron DeSantis or just wild, Florida man stories. I sell it as, and it is, I can't think of a state that's more different than Washington State. So it's sort of checking in on this totally different state in the union, but also it gives me an opportunity to try to put some tentacles in Florida. So that's one of the ways that I'm trying to achieve that.
And have you noticed since over the months that your base of listeners / viewers are starting to broaden? Like, are you finding more and more people that are not from Seattle or Washington who are following your
Yeah,
stuff?
I've seen that across my social media pages as well. Florida, Texas, I've seen some folks who have sent me emails from Texas. And so it's just a matter of, like you said, finding a balance between, what's happening locally to really continue to cater to the base that makes sense for me, but also to find ways to nationalize stories. And so, yeah, I'm starting to see it slowly grow, but it's just going to take that consistent sort of focus on national stories that make sense to my audience.
How do you interact with your audience? Like, obviously there's the one-way broadcasting that you do. Do you make a point of trying to interact with your either free or paid community at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always on my Facebook page, just responding to comments and things like that. And so I try to engage as much as I can. If somebody sends me an email with an actual question or inquiry, I try to get back to them. Or if they just send me a compliment, I try to get back to them. Although right now I'm inundated with other emails, and so I haven't been great at that. And then Patreon is great because you can send a direct message. So if a subscriber wants to get a hold of me, the best way I tell them is through Patreon, because it pops up in my inbox and I can respond to them that way really, really easily. So yeah, I would say I'm active when it comes to engagement with the audience.
Yeah, but you haven't tried to launch a paid community on Facebook groups or Slack or something like that where paying members get exclusive access to you or anything?
No, I have a tier on Patreon. It's a $10 a month tier where we do a around an hour live Q&A every month. And so that's something that's an added feature that they get for paying a little bit more. And that's always really fun. I usually bring a drink, some sort of cocktail, and we sit there for an hour and just shoot the what and have a good time.
Have there been any things that you've done that have since launching that have really exploded, bigger than most of the other stuff you've done that surprised you or anything like that?
Yeah, I looked back at this the other day because I kind of wanted to see, okay, what kind of stuff is generating the most activity and subscribers. It tends to be stuff that is around the pandemic, frankly. For instance, Washington State had a really hard time after the vaccine mandate went into place. The state agencies had a really hard time just carrying out basic functions. For instance, we have a big ferry system. Well, they were short-staffed, so people couldn't get off the islands. We have a mountain pass that goes right in the middle of our state, and they had to close it entirely for 3 days, which cut off both sides of the state from one another because they were short on plow truck drivers. And so I had done this commentary on the fact that the state was trying to gaslight people into thinking that the vaccine mandate had nothing to do with the staffing shortages that led to the closure of these mountain passes for 3 days. And it was really shocking, the traction that got. And so I think people have tended nationally to gravitate towards things that are sort of talking about the extreme, what I view as extreme pandemic-related restrictions and mandates out of Washington State.
And so you have a couple thousand subscribers now. You have some sponsors. Seems like you're probably, I don't know if you're matching your salary yet with TV, but you're making somewhat of a middle-class living. What is the kind of future in terms of, do you want this to be a solo endeavor? Do you want to eventually start generating enough revenue to where you start hiring people? Where do you kind of see this going, expanding beyond yourself?
I mean, in a dream scenario, we'd be doing a show every day with some contributors or folks who are coming in. Because as you might know, doing an hour podcast by yourself is kind of hard. And it's also funner when you've got someone in who you can kind of talk to. And so what I ideally would like to do is to create a product that can compete in some kind of meaningful way with a traditional newscast. So it's not going to be a traditional newscast, but an hour show, have guests in, have contributors, doing reporting and contributing stories. So that's what I'd like to do ideally. I am, currently paying contributors to come on and do some reporting on the show, people who are doing independent journalism. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to get to a place where we could hire folks full time to really contribute to the product.
That's interesting. And you always wonder if like the local TV news model could just completely transfer online. I haven't seen a lot of examples of that, but, almost like basically just recreating what you had before, but, completely distributed online.
Yeah, and also just, I have a lot of qualms with the mainstream media. I'm not one of those crazy like fake news people. I think there's a lot of journalists who are doing really hard, important work all across the country, especially in local news. But there is an obvious bias in the news, and I saw it during our coverage of the pandemic. We had anchors basically shaming people who didn't have a vaccine, and just things that I think news has not. Their unwillingness to just really have some introspection about the bias that's happening in newsrooms is troubling to me. And so, yeah, I think we could recreate a traditional TV news product, but really only if we can try to address the reasons why news became so biased in the first place, and could have a product that more people could feel like they could trust. That's the only way I'd be interested in doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Brandi, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
So if you want to become a subscriber, patreon.com/undivided. I'd love to have you come check out the content that we're doing. As I said, we do 3 podcasts a week. You can watch them or you can listen to them. You can also, if you don't like Patreon, I'm on Locals, brandikruse.locals.com. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, if you care to see photos of my dogs. It's like the bulk of what I post on Instagram. But yeah, I really appreciate the time, Simon.
All right, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.